Hello and welcome to the Greasecar installation DVD series. Today we're here in Scottsdale, Arizona to show you how to install your Greasecar conversion kit for the Ford 7.3 liter diesel. Now this covers the years 1999 through 2003. In this video we're going to show you the same step-by-step plan laid out for you in your instruction manual that came with the kit. Now before we get started, let's cover some of the safety basics. Remember that coolant is under pressure when hot, and you should never work on your engine while it's hot. Also, when working under the vehicle, make sure you closely follow the safety instructions laid out on your ramps, jacks, and jack stands, and always make sure somebody is with you when you're working under the vehicle. Let's go over here and show you some of the components. The main kit components you will be installing are the heated fuel tank, the fuel filter and heat exchanger, the 6-port fuel switching solenoid, the fuel manifold. The electrical components will vary based on the kit you've ordered. In this first step, we're going to remove the stock diesel fuel filter housing. First, remove the plastic Powerstroke shroud from above the fuel filter. Drain the diesel fuel filter of fuel using the yellow drain lever on the filter housing. Next, loosen all Vibralock compression nuts. There are 4 compression nuts on the filter housing, 2 on the passenger side and 2 on the driver's side. First, disconnect the 2 compression nuts on the passenger side of the filter housing. Next, disconnect the compression nuts on the driver's side of the filter assembly. Once the compression nuts have been disconnected, disconnect the wiring harness connected to the rear of the housing. Loosen the 2 mounting bolts holding the filter housing in place. These are in the lower front of the filter housing and go through the high-pressure oil pump. Next, remove the fuel filter housing from the engine bay. Next, pull the fuel filter drain hose from the back of the housing. This hose is not clamped and will generally come loose as the filter is lifted out of place. You will need to hang on to one of these bolts for later use. Step 2, we're going to adapt and swap the fittings. First, remove Vibralock compression fittings from passenger side of filter housing. Set these parts aside for later use. Using the TFE Teflon paste, thread and tighten the 1/8 inch elbow, part 5, and the 1/8 inch plug, part 3, into the diesel filter housing. Next, remove the brass fitting from the opposite side of the filter housing. Thread this brass fitting into the diesel feed barb fitting, part 2, as shown here, and set aside for later use. So we tighten this up. Then we want to hang on to this part for later. Next, thread the 1/4 inch elbow, part 4, into the open port from which we remove the brass fitting in step 3. Facing forward, just like that, along with these connectors. In the next step, we will remove the pressure regulator from the stock filter housing and cover this opening with the cover plate, part 8. The pressure regulator taken out of the stock diesel filter will now be placed in the Greasecar fuel manifold. Using clean vegetable oil, lubricate the part to provide easy installation. Place the valve basket into the fuel manifold. Place the valve spring and plunger into the valve basket. Spring in. Next, place the valve cover over the spring and plunger. Be sure the small indentations are lined up properly and tighten the hex screws. Be sure to use the Greasecar supplied bolts to secure the pressure regulator. Make sure that it looks like it's nice and sealed. It's flat. Thread and tighten the pressure regulator adapter, part 6, onto the valve cover. This is where the return fuel from injection will be coming from. Next, thread the Vibralock compression fittings that were removed from the passenger side of the diesel filter assembly into the fuel manifold, as shown here. Next, we're going to attach the stock filter housing to the included bracket. Using the provided bolts, secure the diesel filter housing to the bracket, as shown here. Attach and connect fuel manifold in the engine bay. Don't forget to replace the old rubber Vibralock bushings with the new Viton bushings. Next, using one of the bolts that originally held the diesel filter in place, secure the manifold in place. Next, connect the two fuel rails to the Greasecar manifold. Next, connect the diesel supply fuel fitting to the stock steel fuel line. Next, install the return diesel fuel fitting, part 7, to the steel diesel return fuel line.
Okay, now that's nice and tight. We've got both of these fittings down. Now we move on to the fuel pump.
Next, we're going to relocate the stock diesel fuel pump. The stock diesel fuel pump is located under the driver's seat along the frame rail. It is necessary to move this pump into the engine bay. The pump is held to the frame by a bracket. Loosen the bolts to free the pump. The connection at the rear of the pump is a rubber hose pushed over the barb of the plastic fuel line connector. Remove the hose from the barb. The front connection to the pump uses a threaded connection with a copper washer. It is a good idea to clamp off the hoses so fuel will not leak. The pump itself will have fuel in it as well, so be ready with the drain pan. Next, disconnect the positive and negative electrical connections and mark each wire. You will later need to run wire from this spot up to your new pump location in the engine bay.
But you can see the red and white.
Using the included aluminum barb fitting, part 1A, and the length of 5/16 inch fuel line, reconnect the fuel line void created by removing the fuel pump. Secure each end with a hose clamp.
Pull this off, and you'll see that nothing's coming out of here, and that's a good thing.
It's a good idea to mark the A and B side of the valve assembly. This will make it easier to connect the correct fuel lines in the steps ahead. Next, using the orange clamps attached to the provided bracket, secure the fuel pump. This can be tightened using a 4mm Allen wrench. Next, we're going to mount the vegetable fuel filter. The provided vegetable fuel filter and heat exchange assembly are to be mounted onto the Ford alternator bracket, as shown here. Remove the Ford bolt, place the Greasecar filter bracket over the hole, and replace the bolt.
Send line is here, your turn line is here, and there's lots of room. And make sure it's not hitting the belt.
In this step, we begin the fuel plumbing. Cut short 15-inch lengths of fuel line for the diesel supply and return, fuel pressure regulator, and the manifold supply. Before inserting the bracket that holds the diesel pump, the diesel filter, and the fuel control valves, A and B, it's a good idea to begin plumbing your fuel connections while you still have access to the diesel lines and the manifold. Follow the fuel plumbing diagram included in your manual. Don't forget to add and tighten the hose clamps to the rubber line.
Okay.
Next, we're going to insert the bracket with the pump, filter, and valves. Once you have made as many connections as possible, you can install the bracket that holds the fuel pump, diesel filter, and valves. Make fuel connections according to the fuel schematic laid out in your installation manual. Detach the electrical connection between the factory studs that originally held the engine cover. Fit the two grommet line mounting holes over these studs and tighten down the nuts. After installing the bracket, reconnect the plug through the hole in the bracket shown here. There are three identifications for the ports: NO, which means normally open, NC, which means normally closed, and COM, which means common. The fuel connections are made as follows. Step 1, connect the diesel supply hose from the diesel tank to the normally open port on valve A. Be sure to secure the hose using a hose clamp and tighten so that no air can seep through.
Okay. And now,
Step 2, connect the vegetable oil filter output to the normally closed port on valve A.
okay, nice.
Next, connect the COM port on valve A to the input of the lift pump. Make sure you have installed part 1, including the copper ring, onto the output side of the fuel pump. Next, connect the lift pump output to the fuel manifold supply line.
Okay.
Next, connect the fuel pressure regulator to the COM port of valve B. Next, connect the normally open port on valve B to the diesel tank return line. Next, connect the vegetable oil input line to one side of the 3/8" brass T. Next, connect the normally closed port of valve B to the brass T, leaving enough slack in the line to easily lift the vegetable oil filter from the heat exchanger. Next, connect the length of fuel line to the brass T. Complete the fuel line connections by connecting the diesel supply line to the adapter on the stock diesel filter housing. Next, we're going to mount the tank either in the bed or, as shown here, the back of the vehicle. A tank strapping kit is included with cleats and screws to anchor the ends of the tank straps. First, drill two 1 3/8" holes. Deburr the holes using a file as shown here. To protect the hoses, insert the provided grommets. First, feed the coolant hose through the hole. Run the coolant hose along the passenger side rail. Feed it over the body mount connected to the rail, and connect it to the filter head shown here. In order to get the right measurement, temporarily secure the hose using zip ties. With the right amount of slack, cut the first coolant hose and remove from the vehicle. Next, taper the end of the PEX line, lubricate with oil, and insert into the cut length of the first coolant line. Insert the PEX line, leaving a minimum of 12 inches hanging out on either side. With the PEX line inserted, reinstall the first coolant line. Using some vegetable oil, lubricate the O-rings and the compression nuts.
I'm never going to be able to. We don't want to tighten this down all the way yet, only enough to keep the O-ring from sliding out.
Next, terminate the hose on the filter side.
Okay, now it's nice and tight.
Next, we will terminate the hose on the tank side. Now it is time to route the second length of coolant hose along the same path. Next, terminate the tank side of the second coolant line. Once in place, both hoses can be secured to the belly of the truck with the supplied hose hangers. Next, we're going to make the coolant hose connections. The included T-fittings must be inserted into the feed and return hoses to and from the cabin heater. Cut the coolant feed hose and insert the T-fittings so that a short length of hose will run from the T-fitting to the upper coolant port on the filter heater. Use hose clamps to secure the fittings.
What we want to do is route this so that it's nice and safe. Never want to.
Once the supply line of the coolant line is connected, you can reinstall any air intake hoses. Next, cut the coolant return hose and insert the T-fittings so that the return hose coming from the vegetable oil tank can be connected.
What is that, coolant?
Next, fill up the coolant reservoir with the proper coolant mixture to compensate for added volume and lost coolant. As the location of the fuel pump is now changed from the rail to the engine compartment, it is necessary to splice 2 leads from the existing location on the fuel rail to the new location in the engine compartment. First, cut the stock fuel pump leads 1 inch from the ring terminals. Using the included butt connectors, connect the included wire to the cut leads. Route the wire safely through the engine compartment to the fuel pump. With the new fuel pump harness routed to the pump, use the included ring terminals to connect the harness to the pump. Again, take note of the wire color to correctly connect the fuel pump to the valves. This completes the standard equipment installation for your Ford Powerstroke Greasecar conversion kit.